Greetings and welcome to Module 3 of 3 for Class 1 in Psychopathology and Family Systems. Through this series of slides, we're going to continue with understanding human behavior and the context for how those individuals with mental illness were historically treated. The primary aim, though, is on humanizing treatment. So let's start with that. We're going to begin with a brief perspective on the era of asylums in America. As was mentioned in Module 2, coinciding with both the supernatural and the somatogenic theory eras, the focus was on protecting the public from those individuals with mental illness. So this meant that the mentally ill and anybody else who was incapable of self-maintenance, whether that was because of unemployment or because of limited financial resources, those individuals, it was thought, needed to be isolated and placed in restrictive environments away from the walking well. Government entities then took it upon themselves to place the undesirables in asylums and in institutions. However, and sadly, the funding for such institutions was placed on the shoulders of those individuals who could not really provide nor care for themselves. So to finance the asylums, the inhabitants were on display for others in the public to pay to leer at. And often the conditions were filthy and the inhabitants were treated like animals, often considered not to have emotional feelings or even to experience physical pain. And this makes me think how convenient that was, because that sort of thinking lent easily to the implementation of the treatment remedies of the time, like we talked about before, bloodletting and exorcism through trephination. While this slide may be difficult to read here because of, so I ask you, what are your thoughts thus far about the history of normal and abnormal behavior? As mentioned, we as providers, we want to extend humane treatment to the mentally ill, and that begins with diagnosing from a contextual perspective. Humanitarian views really ushered in a more humane approach to care, at least for some individuals. So instead of being on display and being equated with animals, separated cruelly from the general public and purposefully being institutionalized, the humanitarian view introduced things like purposeful activity and hygiene. Dorothea Dix was a pioneer in ushering in this sort of compassionate care and helping to establish state hospitals. So during this era, psychogenic theory would be the primary driver of care, with the introduction of psychotropic medications continuing to include that sort of somatogenic thinking into the present day, that thinking of chemical imbalance, similar to the old notions of balancing the four humors. So let's think about our modern day asylum, separate from what Dorothea Dix was able to usher in. While advancement was well-intentioned, placing those who had mental illness in the least restrictive environment versus the most restrictive environment that was occurring during supernatural theory time frames. Deinstitutionalization meant replacing those sort of long-term care facilities with emergency rooms, community mental health agencies, correctional facilities, and even group homes today. For BIPOC individuals, mental health care is still often not readily accessible. Over 50% of BIPOCs are incarcerated that have mental health concerns. So instead of getting mental health help, they end up incarcerated instead, receiving a subpar standard of care. So apart from becoming educationally prepared, what would it look like to demonstrate expertise and awareness of the various sensitivities needed to provide theory and counseling to a wide audience, right? How can we usher in humane treatment approaches that's person-centered, that welcomes people into the therapy space and provides them with a level of care that meets the standard? Let's take a moment to switch gears and focus on America's influence on the world. Even though the US does not share language or customs with the rest of the world, it leads the consciousness for the world to include perspectives about food, fashion, and even what it means to be mentally ill. America's definitions of illness cross the globe. They become the standard, but it's the standard without proper consideration for context. And so, although potentially well-meaning, meaning when I'm seeing somebody, if I'm doing humanitarian work, I'm taking my conceptualizations with me. Although well-meaning, when the world arrives on these shores, our definitions about mental health don't necessarily shift to accommodate other cultures and experiences. Our definitions about mental health don't necessarily shift when we go abroad to offer help and aid. Remarkably, the DSM is authored by American psychiatrists, American psychologists, and other American counseling individuals. It entails westernized views of how people should respond, and it evidences Western standards for psychological care and behavior. Often, U.S. standards are applied to non-Western issues. Again, while well-intended, such an approach may not adequately consider context and ethnicity. Illness cannot be understood separated from context and culture. Culture potentially influences how behavior and how illness present. I'm pausing here so that that can take effect. Illness cannot be understood separated from context and culture potentially influences how behavior and illness present. This becomes particularly relevant when we're working with different types of individuals with different cultural backgrounds and ethnicities. Let's transition to approaches for understanding psychological behavior. We know context is important, but let's delve into that a little deeper. I've repeated this, you're going to hear it throughout. The cause often gives direction for the solution, and finding the cause for behavior is often complex and requires deep examination, observation, and rich assessment. A multi-layered approach is hoped to sufficiently explain the various issues and maladies that are going to be presented by our clients. And those layers include biological, psychological, developmental, and social dimensions that we need to be aware of. Now, these particular slides, they're two separate pictures, but these concentric circles give some examples of impactful parameters. So, for instance, social factors to be considered in understanding etiology for behavior might include social supports or family relationships and stressors or socioeconomic status, while biological determinants could entail gender, age, physical health, or disease. What does this mean? When we are trying to understand a diagnosis and what is going on for a person, we have to be multi-layered and multi-dimensional in our approach, thinking about the psychological, the social, the biological parameters that explain what it is we're looking at. If we expand on biology in particular, it takes us to an awareness of epigenetics, which identifies that genetics are not fixed but subject to change, and adverse life events can alter genetic structure, either triggering or activating gene expression. This slide and the next two elaborate and better explain epigenetics and the impact on child development, the impacts on the brain, as well as the lifespan. I'm not going to read each of these. You can go through this on your own, but they certainly explain it in more detail. An understanding of the diathesis stress model explained in the textbook also speaks to the interplay between genes and the environment. In other words, there is a point of susceptibility such that with the right stressor, it has the ability to exacerbate a condition until a disorder develops. The cure is often found in the cause. So, in thinking in these multi layered ways, we start to pinpoint where we might focus our efforts and treatment. This is explained expertly in the research findings of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and the traumatic impacts of adverse experiences are lasting and detrimental, shortening the lifespan up to 20 years for those individuals with 6 or more ACEs, as is shown here in the slide. So context should make a difference with diagnosing. We should want to know about the experiences of the person in front of us. And as therapists, we should be certain to think about or to think multidimensionally when identifying illness and its cause, because cause often lends direction for how to treat what it is that we see. This is another slide that just demonstrates a graph of the lasting effects of ACEs. Psychological events, if we expand on that. Psychological factors affect development as well. Psychological events can shape learning and condition a person to certain ways of thinking or perceiving or processing. Learning how to behave can happen at unconscious levels, it can be indirect, and it may even reflect survival behaviors. All of this is to be considered when making diagnoses, when considering who is and who is not abnormal. I can't stress the multidimensional focus enough. So, the takeaways. How does this information find fit with practicing in the field of counseling? How might this information find relevance as it regards family units? And how do you intend to humanize the treatment of the mentally ill? In conclusion, conceptualizations about what constitutes abnormal behavior stems from a rich and disturbing past. It means that we understand that society influences what is and is not abnormal. Scientists study behavior and ultimately decide what is clinical and pathological. Importantly, what is decided shifts. What is diagnosable today may not be diagnosable at a later time. So we have to have an openness and an understanding about that. We want to be mindful that we don't diagnose without considering culture, context, time, and other multidimensional influencers like biology, experiences, gender, ethnicity, and more. What we learn about the cause of behavior gives direction for how to treat those issues. We want to fully understand the person, the behaviors, and the cause.